I have the honor to introduce our amazing speaker. I'm so happy that one of my colleagues at Michigan State University is here with us. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University. At MSU, Kathleen directs a research and development unit called MESH, which focuses on building open infrastructure for the future of scholarly communication. She is also a project director of Humanities Commons. It's an open access, open source network serving 28,000 scholars and practitioners across the humanities and around the world. Prior to her stint at MSU, she served as Associate Executive Director and Director of Scholarly Communication at the Modern Language Association, where she was the managing editor of PMLA and other MLA publications, including overseeing the development of MLA Handbook. And Kathleen is author of many books, and her latest is Generous Thinking. I actually have, excuse me, a copy of that. And Kathleen, I think you signed it. Generous Thinking, a radical approach to saving the university. Please buy this book. It's really nice.
Okay. Are you now seeing my slides? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. I want to start quickly by thanking Regina, my wonderful colleague here at MSU, for inviting me to talk with you. And I also want to thank Nicole Allen and the rest of the Open Ed team for the extraordinary amount of work that's required in organizing an event like this. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share it with Leslie and to get to talk just a bit about a few issues that have been worrying me with respect to the present course of higher education in general, as well as what my colleagues and I have been trying to do about it. You'll see that I cover some of the same terrain that Leslie did in his talk, but from a slightly different perspective, sort of backing out to look at some of the political and economic backdrop in which these changes are happening, and then zooming in to look at a particular potential path out. So all of this starts, unfortunately, with economics and the lock that it has on contemporary ideas about the public good. So in June 2021, an independent economic group released a report indicating that the University of Michigan, Michigan State University, and Wayne State University together boosted the state economy by $19.3 billion in 2019. And a figure that they went on to note is more than 20 times the funding that's provided to them by the state. It's an extraordinary report, and it confirms the thing that we all know, right? That public research universities are crucial contributors to the economic well-being of their communities. And our universities not only conduct the research and development that leads to new business opportunities in the state, but they also build the educated workforce that's ready to take on the challenges that our communities face now and into the future. This is great news, and it's particularly great to have numbers like these that can be used in arguments about the value of public investment in institutions of higher education, especially at a moment when relationships between legislatures and boards of trustees and universities are increasingly strained. But I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about why reports like this one make me nervous. It may sound weird, but frankly, it's because they do too good a job of tying the public vision of the value of the university to its economic impact. And in the process, they inadvertently run the risk of undermining the purpose of the university as a broad service to the public, rather than as an engine of economic growth, right? And so they end up turning attention away from the ways that investments in the non-money making parts of the university ultimately pay off in the public good. In other words, the danger of a report like this one, as positive as its results are, is that it speaks to a particular mindset in particularly American culture, but a mindset that's becoming predominant in lots of other places as well. A mindset that's primed to hear it, right? With the result that it completely overshadows all of the good that the university does in areas other than the economic. And that focus on economic impact may be fine in good times, right? When taxpayers and legislators feel like they can afford to invest in a broad range of kinds of exploration and education on campus. But in bad times, when budgets are tight and jobs are scarce, many begin to look at those kinds of exploration that don't have obvious or direct economic benefits as luxuries, right? As frivolous, as extraneous to the institution's mission, precisely because the institution's mission and the public good that it serves have come to be wholly tied to ideas about economic growth. So there is, in other words, this deeply ingrained mindset that lends itself to the assumption that economic development, both at the social level and at the individual level, is the primary good that the university can and should serve. And this is a mindset that I would love to see us work on changing. It has its underpinnings in our faith in the extraordinary creative potential unleashed by capitalism, but it leads to the assumption that all of the problems in the contemporary world can and should be approached through market-based solutions. This tight focus on the market as the telos of contemporary life is often discussed under the umbrella of neoliberalism on campus. Neoliberalism is admittedly one of those terms that's been so relentlessly misunderstood and misused that it's become a kind of caricature, right? It's an empty critique now with all of the force that bourgeois had in the mid-1970s. But it's the kind of term that causes a lot of people to stop listening, right? Because we know what's coming is both profoundly ideological and likely not to mean exactly what its speaker thinks it means. But it's nonetheless an important concept and one that can tell us a lot about what's happened within Western culture since the early 1980s. Right? The forces that have encouraged the public to question the value of institutions of higher education, as well as the other forms of public investment in the public good. I mean, in fact, neoliberalism is part of what surfaced the question of whether there can be such a thing as the public good in the first place. Just as Margaret Thatcher argued in the 1980s that there was no such thing as society, but instead only individuals and families that needed to look out for themselves. So today we find a predominant political perspective, particularly in the US, that holds that all goods are and should be private rather than public, right? Individual rather than social. And the effects of this conviction on our culture today have been corrosive. We've experienced over the last 4 decades a dramatic increase in inequality, both economic and social, as those who already have benefit from an environment in which rewards accrue to the individuals who are already most equipped to pursue them. We've also seen a radical decline in our cultural sense of shared obligations to, or even basic care and respect for others. Broadly speaking, we've lost our collective grip on the notions that our individual actions affect others, that we should act with those others in mind, that we share common concerns, and that we're collectively responsible for ensuring that we provide a viable future for all of us. And without those understandings, without a recognition that the global crises that we face today require responsible social engagement and collective action, poverty will continue to increase, structural racism will continue to grow, and the very prospect of a livable planet is thrown into question. So, I want to pause here and acknowledge that I've managed to get in a very few minutes from a highly encouraging report on the economic impact of public research universities to the question of whether the future will be a livable one. And there are several links along the way that I haven't fully explored, not to mention all kinds of alternative paths that we have to consider. So I want to backtrack a bit. If, as I'm arguing here, Our overdetermined focus on the economic good that universities provide has the potential to undermine the other kinds of goods that our institutions serve. I mean, what are those other goods? How are they undermined? And what do we lose if we lose them? How might we begin to ensure that they remain a crucial part of the public vision of what the university is for? So in order to explore the university's purpose in serving the public good and the ways that the neoliberal understanding of the university's function have weakened it almost beyond recognition, we might begin by thinking through the distinctions drawn in economics among the four primary types of goods, right, and the ways that they are defined. First, through their excludability, right, or whether non-paying customers can be prevented from using them. And second, through their rivalrousness, or whether their use uses them up. Right, so public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, meaning that no one can be excluded from using them and no one's use uses them up for others. Private goods are typically both excludable and rivalrous, right, and are typically market-based as a result. Goods that are non-excludable but rivalrous are thought of as common pool resources. And these were the goods that were assumed for a long time to be subject to the tragedy of the commons until the work of Elinor Ostrom demonstrated the potential for shared governance in ensuring their sustainability. And I will be coming back to that in a little bit. But finally, club goods. Right? These are those that are excludable but non-rivalrous, right? Goods that are not diminished through use, but that people can be prevented from using unless they pay for them. The question is, what kind of good higher education and the knowledge that it provides and creates are and should be? Right? Knowledge is certainly non-rivalrous. If I have it and I share it with you, I don't wind up with less of it as a result. Right? The question lies in excludability, where once knowledge and the higher education that it fosters might have been seen as striving to be non-excludable, right? Making itself available to anyone desiring it. Since the 1960s, it's become increasingly excludable, right? Restricted to those who can pay. Access to knowledge is today a club good, in other words, rather than the public good that was once imagined to best serve our society, right? Supported by all for the benefit of all. Now, our social ideals regarding private education have always been flawed, even at their most promising moments. Right? Our system of land-grant universities was founded on the appropriation of land from indigenous nations, and the GI Bill supported rather than undermining racial inequities. But the underlying principle remains important, right? The understanding that the university's purpose is the broad education of the public. And that broad education has always been understood to have benefits beyond the directly economic, creating a world that's not just more prosperous, but better in a much deeper sense. So in order to focus on that better, we need collectively to rethink the systems through which we produce and share knowledge, both with one another, with our students, and with the world. Ensuring that we keep our focus on the larger project of collective understanding that's at the heart of the academic mission. And this mission requires us to find ways to treat knowledge not as a club good, right, restricted to those of us who are on the inside, but as a public good, right, created for all, available to all. And this, as Tressie McMillan Cottom reminds us in lower ed, is not a problem for technological innovation or a market product. This requires politics. The university's present situation, after all, has its roots not just in economics, but in politics, right? The institutions that not too long ago aspired to serve as a highly accessible engine of social mobility, making a rich liberal arts-based education broadly available, today face not just a drastic reduction in their affordability, but an increasing threat to their very public orientation in the first place, right? As rampant privatization not only shifts the burden of paying for higher education from the state to individual students and families, but it also turns the work of the institution from the creation of a shared social good, right, that broadly educated public, to instead focus on the production of market-oriented individual benefits. And many of our students are just as embedded in this privileging of individual benefit as is the rest of our culture. I mean, our students have been told repeatedly that the purpose of a college degree is developing the skill set that will lead directly to a lucrative career. And given how much they and their families are paying and indeed going into debt for that degree, it's understandable that they feel that way. Preparing our students to enter the workforce is not a bad thing, right? And I'm not at all arguing that we should just simply wave that aside. But if the goal of the university should be producing graduates who are not just successful economic actors, but who are well-rounded humans, right? Who are able to think creatively about the complex conditions in which we live today, and who are willing to contribute not just materially, but socially, ethically, even morally to the improvement of the world around them, not just for themselves, but for others. If that's the goal, then we need to transform our engagements with students in order to show them a different path. And this is where generous thinking comes in. We need to find ways to use our collective knowledge for the public good, demonstrating our deep connections to and indeed our responsibility for the world around us. The university's educational mission is and should be cultivating that generous thinking, preparing our students not just for the professions that might lead to wealth production, but for the various pursuits that life offers. I mean, we're educating the leaders of tomorrow, not just in the conventionally understood political and business realms, but in the kinds of engagement that will help their communities grow from the grassroots up. And that mission demands that we focus on what is required to make a better world, right? Both on campus and off. It requires that we rethink our institutions' often unspoken structural biases, including that toward economic impact. It requires us to focus not just on making it possible for more kinds of people to achieve conventionally coded forms of success, but on examining what constitutes success, how it's measured, and why. And all of that requires a values-first approach to higher education and an ongoing examination of the ways that these values are instantiated in institutional structures and processes. So, if we understood the well-being of communities to lie not just in the individual economic prosperity that can result, but in terms of individuals' ability to work together, right? To engage in collective action toward a wide range of common goals, we might begin thinking about how the university might itself begin to rely on systems that support connection and collaboration. We might think about the infrastructure of teaching itself and how it might be used to help shape a more richly understood public good. I mean, as Leslie's talk demonstrates, we have become increasingly dependent on campus on a wide range of platforms that deliver our core services, right? So learning management systems, which he discussed, but also student information systems, publishing and communication systems, research information management systems. And by and large, all of those platforms are platforms over which we have very, very little control. Right? They're vendor owned, they're corporation controlled, and as such, they are far more responsible to their shareholders than they are to us or to our students. They appear to serve needs on campus that we cannot fill ourselves, and yet there's no sense of service in their relationship to our institutions, only extraction. Right? They take in our content, they take in our metrics, they take in our vast and growing annual fees, and they leave us dependent, privatized, beholden to economic forces that do not serve the public good. So this is just one of the reasons why my colleagues and I have been working to develop an open source, open access, nonprofit, academy-owned and governed alternative to such extractive corporate platforms. Humanities Commons instantiates several key principles. First, that higher education will benefit from all of us doing more of our work together in public, where the publics that we need to support our institutions can begin to see the significance of the work that we do. And second, that institutions of higher education must do everything they can to resist and reverse the privatization that's overtaken them, restoring service to the public good, not just to their mission statements, but to the heart of their actual missions. And part of that resisting privatization involves turning away from some of the externally developed and deployed systems, or as Leslie points out, even worse, the internally developed and then spun off into corporate entity systems on which we have become dependent. Instead, reserving our investments and our labor for systems and platforms and infrastructures whose missions genuinely align with our own, whose values mirror our own, and to whose governance we can contribute. And this is true of a wide range of systems and platforms on which higher education relies, but perhaps nowhere has it become more pressing than in thinking about educational technology. I mean, we, all of us, librarians, instructional technologists, instructors, administrators, all of us need collectively to turn our attention to developing the shared publicly oriented systems that we can count on to support us as we develop new modes of open knowledge sharing, right? Modes that might help higher education re-engage with the public good. But developing these collaborative, community-oriented forms of infrastructure, forms that can create the paradigm shift that we're going to need in order to change the direction of the future of higher education. All of this is going to require some careful thinking about the work that will be necessary to make these platforms sustainable. This is one of the issues that caused those platforms that were developed on university campuses to be spun off into corporate entities, is that, you know, an individual campus can produce a thing, but sustaining that thing for a very long time is not something that we've been equipped to do, right? And this kind of sustainability that we need to be thinking of is not just financial sustainability or technical sustainability. I mean, those are the kinds of sustainability that we typically think of in terms of when we reflect on these kinds of platforms. But most importantly, I believe we really need to be thinking about social sustainability, right? Or a deep focus on the relationships that are required to build and maintain our shared infrastructure. Thinking about these relationships under the rubric of social sustainability directs our attention not just to the determination of a group of people to support a particular project, but rather to their commitment to this concept that they are a group, that they're working together in the first place. Right? Collective action requires a kind of solidarity, in other words, a readiness to put the needs of the whole in front of local demands, a determination to stand together in support of projects that may not necessarily seem to be our own personal top priority. And this form of solidarity, I'm increasingly convinced, is a necessary prerequisite for successful, sustainable development of nonprofit, open source, community-owned networks and platforms. Now, the connection between sustainability and solidarity brings us back to the work of Elinor Ostrom, who focused on common pool resource management. She argued fiercely against that conventional wisdom that the so-called tragedy of the commons was inevitability. That what made it inevitable was what's been called the free rider problem, right? Which derives from the assumption that when individuals can't be prevented from using commonly held resources, but they also can't be compelled to contribute to their upkeep, some number of individuals will avail themselves of the resources without supporting them. And as the number of free riders grows, the resources become prone to overuse and eventually become unsustainable. Or so the conventional wisdom had it. The only means imagined to help prevent the tragedy of the commons before Ostrom was external regulation, whether through privatization or nationalization of the resources involved. Ostrom, however, studied a wide range of community-held fisheries and demonstrated through them that community-based systems and structures for ensuring those resources' sustainability were possible, provided the right modes of self-organization and self-governance were in place. relationships, in other words. I mean, there are lots of potential examples of free and open digital scholarly platforms and projects that are seeking to provide community-based solutions that avoid the pitfalls of privatization, but all of them face a common problem, right? There is often sufficient support available for building and implementing such systems, but there aren't funding programs designed to ensure that they can be maintained. And as a result, the tools and platforms often accrue technical debt that becomes increasingly difficult to manage, rapidly making the projects appear unsustainable and thus leaving them in danger of real obsolescence. So some argue that the best means of ensuring the sustainability of projects like these is economic, right? Eliminate the free rider problem by enclosing the commons, requiring individuals or institutions to pay to use them. But this privatization is often the very problem that the community developed projects were developed in order to solve. So like with Ostrom's fishing communities, it's incumbent on us to find the right modes of self-organization and self-governance that can keep our projects open and thriving. Building open platforms and keeping them functioning is not something that any of our institutions can do it alone. You look back at the narratives of all of those learning management systems, and the issue is that they start on a campus, they take in a few other collaborators, and then it becomes difficult to sustain without the kinds of relationship building that we really need to do. I mean, so this is something that we must do together and at scale, right? We can build and we can share and we can maintain the infrastructure that will allow all of us to genuinely open education and to make the knowledge that we develop for and with our students a public good. I've got a lot more to say about what would be required for us to commit to that work, especially about the challenges involved in shifting the relationships between our institutions from the competitive to the collective. But making those changes, if we can do it, will enable the university and the public good that it serves to become the infrastructure that allows us to build a better world. So at Humanities Commons, we've been working to develop a model that will encourage organizations and institutions to invest in a shared network, to support it in an ongoing way, to recognize that not only do they belong to the collective, but that the collective belongs to them and that its future depends on them, right? And making that case requires not just a flexible technology or a working revenue model, but far more importantly, a compelling governance model, one that gives all of us a voice in the network's future and a stake in its outcomes. As Eleanor Ostrom's work demonstrates, building the community that supports a platform like Humanities Commons and enabling that community to become self-governing are crucial preconditions for its success. This is true for a wide range of open source academy-owned infrastructure projects, which require collective action for real sustainability. And it's at the heart of open education, right? Your institutions, of course, have very different structures, very different requirements, very different needs, and yet you share the same goals, right? The development, distribution, and preservation of new forms of knowledge. And that you're all here together, looking for ways to meet your shared goals, despite your different local needs, gives me hope. It's a key form of generosity, one that can help us escape the bottom line orientation of the neoliberal university to embrace instead the wide range of public goods that the university should serve. But if we're going to reclaim our public mission and to reclaim control of the work that's produced in and by the university, we're going to have to do so together, right? Acting not just in solidarity with, but with generosity toward one another, toward our students, toward the other institutions to which we are inevitably connected, and toward the public that we all jointly serve. If we're going to develop and sustain the kinds of community-supported infrastructure that can enable open education, we have to genuinely become and act as a community. So I'm honored to have had the chance to talk with you this afternoon as you continue the work of building that community. Thank you so much.